Maria leads Natwest climate and economics team, and again, like all our speakers today, brings with her an absolute wealth of experience. But you're a keen author on sustainability topics and supported governments, international organisations and the private sector on ways to address climate change. So, Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to check. So, hi, I'm Maria Carvalho. I'm the head of climate economics and data within Natwest. I actually just joined in March of this year. I have about 15 years of experience working on climate. I was actually there when the economics of climate change came out. So it was Lord Nicholas Stern. How many of you know about this report that came out in 2006? The economics of climate change? All right, one person. So that was actually a landmark report. Up to that point, most of the reports that were coming out on climate change were science. And that's a very important part of what we need to understand, which is regards to what exactly is happening with our planet and understanding the physical processes that regulate it and what exactly is happening within human economic activities that are addressing it. So what Richard provided us is a really good and very important efforts. But at the same time, you need to take the science, and there was a gentleman earlier today who was then talking about what we do about it. And that's why the Economics of Climate Change report was really important in 2006 coming out, exactly directed to policymakers and really understanding those parts of how do we think through what's the costs are of addressing climate change. And what I'd like for us to think about is not just the costs, but the investments. So I know I'm representing a bank. We think about finance. We think about it in investing terms, but it's a really important term for investment. How do we invest to save our species, as Akhil said earlier, and to really think through how to embed it within the way a bank thinks, but also for you. Just before I start, I actually, we've saved a little bit of time, I just want to, it's a bit of a surreal experience for me coming here to Reading, not because of Reading in and of itself, but 22 years earlier, my father had decided to go on a business trip. He took my mother and my brother because they happened to be with him while I was in a different country. And I was very snarky about that because it was so unfair that he got to bring them to London and actually really enjoy London while he came out to Reading to work with a consultant that his company had contracted. Now the second thing about, and in retaliation for that, I decided to come about 6 years later to come and live in London, study in London, and then work. Now the reason why that's a bit surreal is because my father at that time worked for Saudi Aramco. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I'm properly an oil brat. And my entire education is funded by oil, actually. But when he came here, the reason why he was in Reading was, and this is how I actually learned about Reading, and this is how I always thought about Reading, was it is a hub for oil consultants. It has a very strong engineering focus. A lot of the different companies and a lot of the work that my father did when he came to London, he came to Reading, basically to figure out how to design oil infrastructures. And the project he came in 2000 was with a consultancy that was helping them to do the pre-feasibility studies of the largest crude oil processing plant in the world. Now I'm coming 22 years later to Reading and was really inspired just from the beginning out there on really seeing Reading think through entrepreneurship for climate and the solutions for climate. And so I'd like to see this as a bit of a U-turn in the way I see Reading, and that's a little bit of my personal story. And what I really hope here is for you to think through how Reading can be that climate hub for SMEs, because truly, one of the things that Natwest has done in terms of our own research, and something that I've actually really appreciated in the past year working with Natwest, and I'll tell you why Natwest really cares about SMEs, so small and medium enterprises and innovation, is because of that, we really need you to step up. 50%, at least half of the UK's ability to achieve its long-term net zero target is requiring you to step up. Because when we think of the supply chains, particularly with buildings, particularly with transport, also so many different services in IT, in rethinking of how the entire economy is going to have to transform itself to be within planetary boundaries to save our species. it requires SMEs. And what we're finding through that is thinking through as a bank, how do we support SMEs to realize that net zero opportunity? Now, before I get into that, I just want to give a little bit of an understanding of why Natwest is doing this. And again, back to Akhil's point, we have our CEO and our CFO are both women. Actually, I've been pretty surprised with seeing how many women are in leadership positions in Natwest. But our CEO, Alison Rose, in 2019, when she took the helm, she made climate her third pillar. What is her first pillar? SMEs. What is her second pillar? Embedding learning. What is her third pillar? Climate. And this is a very powerful ownership for a CEO to take of one of the largest retail banks in the UK. And it's very important with regards to that notion of embedding purpose, because the next thing she did was get us onto, when it comes to climate, we as NatWest signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. What is the Science Based Targets Initiative? It creates a very clear framework of what a net zero strategy needs to look like. And we have adopted a net zero target that is in the process of being validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. But then we're also, what that means is that we've adopted a net zero target by 2050. This is not just about the emissions from our operations. It's not just about so that's scope 1. It's not just about the emissions from our utilities. That's scope 2. It also includes, and this is very critical, our financed emissions. So who our customers are, their carbon footprint matters to us, because now that's become part of our target. So when I say we have adopted a net zero target, that means by 2050, we have to reach net zero. That means we have an interim target, because this is a requirement for the Science Based Targets Initiative. So in 2030, we have to halve the climate impact of our financed emissions. So that is one of the reasons why I joined NatWest, was because it had set up and signed up to an external standard which had a very clear framework of what was required of anyone who signed up to it. And then it held it to be transparent. So we have to not only disclose our targets, we have to disclose our progress to targets, but we also have to disclose our plan to reach those targets. And that was one of the reasons, that's the reason I joined NatWest in March, because I knew it had signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. We were a sponsor of COP26 in the UK in Glasgow. And because of that, part of the requirements of being a COP sponsor was actually to sign up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which was great, because then it created a huge onus within us to really figure out embedding climate within our entire operation. So we have climate leads, at least 150 across the bank, whose sole ownership is to work with us in figuring out what our transition plan is going to be. Again, why is all of this very important? Because it creates a huge change management within the bank, and it requires us to then think not only across all the sectors to figure out, as Mary said, our most material sectors. So in that case, we have found out. So our two biggest sectors are the property system, specifically mortgages, so the emissions associated with that. So we have a target there. By 2030, half of our mortgage portfolio is going to be EPC ABC. But that's very interesting, because what do we do for those customers who have DEF? That doesn't mean we don't lend to them, but we have to really figure out what our retrofit proposition is. What does that mean? We need SMEs who have the building capabilities to do those retrofits. 2, the second biggest part of our emissions book is agriculture and farmers. So interestingly enough, only 2% of our lending, 20% of our book. That's very emissions intensive. Again, there, even if you go back into Mary's idea, like materiality, out of that, 40% of our emissions from that agriculture book would be from livestock farmers. We're not going to abandon our livestock farmers. We have to figure out a way then, how do we support farmers to actually reduce their emissions? Farmers, another type of SME. Again, going back to materiality, you think of us as a large bank. Actually, most of our customers, either people, many of them SMEs. So again, materiality, how do we support SMEs in terms of reducing their footprint, and then also realizing the net zero opportunity? And we are very clear that they are going to be the engine of growth for the UK economy. But we want to make sure they're an engine of growth for a net zero economy. So how do we help them realize that? So last year, this is what we mean by this. It's a convincing that the net zero economy is a 175 billion revenue opportunity for UK SMEs. And last year we had set out a report and we had released it at COP26 about what that revenue opportunity was. And this really is about, I'm going to emphasize this more and more again, we really need SMEs to step up. And what it is that in terms of realizing, here's a revenue opportunity, you are the engines of growth, what does that look like? So we had this report called the Springboard to Recovery Report. We've updated it this year. It was released in COP27 last year. And so what we see is that what we've calculated from that is there's a 175 billion revenue opportunity, which could contribute to regional growth across the UK. What does the 175 billion growth opportunity mean? It's 40,000 new SMEs need to exist, creating 260 new jobs. That's the growth bit. And the reason why this opportunity went from last year, when we had talked about it, it was 160 billion, now it's 175. What was the increase in the numbers? Because the UK had set out two specific things. One, the net zero strategy, which again, not enough to meet our targets, but still an important step up in terms of the UK government, and also the energy security strategy. Energy security primarily being because of the Ukraine crisis. So with that, we have a 2050 target. We need emissions to decrease by 35% between 2022 and 2030. That requires a lot of SMEs to step up. And one of the biggest parts of that is that not only is this a revenue opportunity, it's also cost savings for our customers. One of the key things we've seen here is that we did a survey and about 25% of our SME customers don't think they'll exist next year, purely because of the costs, right? So they're facing 400% inflation with regards to energy, 300 to 400% in inflation just with their energy costs. And so, but what's amazing in thinking through this is that, and that's basically because the UK has one of the worst housing stock. Actually, it has the worst housing stock in terms of energy efficiency and property system efficiencies in Europe. So if you think about how much energy savings could be achieved just purely through demand side retrofits and actually thinking through electrification in very systemic ways, this would be very important. So going into that, there are 4 top actions for SMEs to decarbonize. They really do play a pivotal role, both by supporting and enabling a lot of the required net zero decarbonization needs to occur, but also benefiting from it, because the payback period has actually become so much better now. So last year when we said it, from last year to this year, the economics have changed so that you have, for putting on rooftop solar, that would pay you back 25% faster. When it comes to insulation, it pays you back, like the time for payback is halved. Just if the energy prices consist to stay the way it is now, it's very critical. So there are 4 actions for SMEs to decarbonize. 1, insulation. And the second is installing low carbon heat. Now, before we start going into heat pumps, I'm just gonna make this very critical point. Insulation first. Heat pumps only work if you have a certain energy performance certificate. So in that notion of, and so that means only 20% of properties in the UK can actually get to a heat pump. But you first need to do the fabrication for insulation. So insulation is your number 1 priority. But the beauty of that is the payback period has halved just because of energy prices. So there's installing low carbon heat, it's switching to EVs, and it's deploying low carbon power. So some of those distributed energy, not just solar, but also batteries to allow for a lot of balancing. So the other thing that I want to say is that this not only is very important when we were doing this analysis, this is not only important in terms of the types of things SMEs can do and where they can create cost savings, but where they can actually become part of the solution. But it is such a huge growth opportunity within the UK. And then by the UK being one of the front runners, it opens you up to the European markets and to the global markets because they need those solutions as well. So the UK economy becoming a first mover in providing both the goods and services opens you out to much larger markets where the investment cost is. So thinking about that in terms of ambition. So what are the net zero revenue opportunities for UK SMEs? And this is some of the analysis that was done. Again, the biggest of that will be in buildings. So, and again, it goes back into that residential retrofitting. We need the supply chains to exist. We also have it in terms of installing the low carbon heat pumps, non-residential heat pumps. Second is the energy supply. The UK government has just in their net zero strategy and their energy security strategy that needs supply chains locally to be able to install to meet that ambition. So they've gone from about a target of 40, when it comes to offshore wind, 40 gigawatts of offshore to 50 gigawatts of offshore. For solar, it's gone from about 30 gigawatts to 45 to 50 gigawatts. That's a huge increase in ambition. But it also is one of those things that actually demonstrates you would need the labor force to be able to do that, not just in terms of the installation, but the maintenance of it. And so again, creating those supply chains, one of the biggest reasons why both for buildings and for energy supply, we don't have enough workforce to be able to do this. We don't have enough of the SMEs to be able to do this. And so it becomes critical in that sense of actually having the ability to have those SMEs realize that opportunity, realize then to think through how can I support, what parts of the supply chain do I get to become part of. And the last thing about this is that's very critical is that what we've seen is very large corporations have signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, or they've set net zero strategies. Again, the requirement of that would be then you actually have to deal with your supply chain. So it's when we talk about scope 3, in any supply chain, the requirement, especially with SBTI, will be think upstream, who are your suppliers, what are your inputs, make sure that becomes low carbon. Then also with your product, that also has to become low carbon. So it puts a lot of then focus on how that can be done. And so with large corporations, what we're seeing is the reason why SMEs are stepping up is because of that, is because their customers are basically asking them to set out net zero transition plans and to figure out how they can reduce their emissions. So you're seeing some very interesting alignment, but so there's a huge demand for it. And we're seeing the demand increasing and increasing on SMEs. But then it's to that point that we said earlier, how? What do we do? What are the skills and what is there? So I just wanted to focus this year's report for SMEs that we had produced actually took a regional focus. So it was a little different from last year. But in that case, it was that there is a 175 billion revenue opportunity, but it's distributed differently within the UK, purely because the population centers are in the south and in the northwest. So in those two critical places, what you're seeing is more and more of the demand for buildings and transport. So a lot of the requirements for net zero decarbonization there means that the revenue opportunity is huge in those two places for the south, London in the south and the northwest. While what we're seeing is in the north and the northeast, a lot of their revenue opportunity is actually in renewables. These are great sites for a lot of large-scale renewables, and so for there would be a lot of there. So there's a regional differentiation between, but it's very, very critical in that case in thinking about that, the 10 billion retrofitting opportunity for SMEs in London, which when you think about London as a nexus, it doesn't mean that all the builders are within London. So it means that you have spillovers with requirements of a lot more of the south as well coming into London, but also across. And so it becomes an opportunity to scale, and using that bit is very important because one of the key things that are happening with supply chains is they don't have the experience. But the more that you're able to develop your skills and experience, the better you get at it. So a lot of those costs go down. And you can tell more and more is that the need, one of the things that we've come out with consumers, so we have another report called Home is Where the Heat Is. And we tried to do 9 customer pilots where Natwest actually sponsored the retrofitting pilots. So customers didn't have to pay for it from those 9. The idea was by the end of this year, we would then take, the report was meant to reveal the whole customer journey, and there were 7 steps to do the retrofit. Because we didn't have enough builders who had the skills and the knowledge to do retrofits, we only managed to achieve 3 or 4 of those milestones from the 9 customer pilots. That just shows you how important this is, right? So in the notion of experiential maturing of the supply chain, getting that, it's very, very critical. But when it comes to London and the South, the biggest opportunities then become in buildings. It also becomes an electricity supply, lesser on transport and farming. So I hope I've convinced you that this is about being holistic. This is about recognizing SME's role in growing, supporting the net zero journey, and we really need you to step up. I cannot emphasize this more. But within that, there are 6 areas that, that become the challenges or the things that SMEs need to do to get in on the net zero opportunity. One is knowing where the funding access is to actually either get access to decarbonizing their own emissions or learning how to realize the net zero opportunity. 2 is awareness in what are those opportunities, what does that look like, also how do I reduce my own emissions. Another one is knowledge on how to improve their climate action, where are the market opportunities. The next one is skills and capabilities, which I've talked about in terms of even upskilling. It's not just about relearning, but just upskilling what you already have. And this is, again, very much with builders and engineers on specifics that are needed, especially with increasing government standards on building regulations. Then there's market access. Where should I go? How do I get access to those markets? How am I trusted? And then the last one is navigation on how to find out those sources of support. So Natwest is very committed. Like I said, Alison made it very, very clear that SMEs are a critical part of her vision for the future. And so we have 4 pillars on ensuring SMEs have access to the funding they need. So in 2020, last year, we had actually announced a 100 billion target that is going to be deployed between 2021 and 2025 called Climate Sustainable Funding and Financing. So what Akila was talking about in terms of sustainably linked loans, that's something that we offer. It goes across all the different types of funding, but it's also purely green loans and different ways in which we offer preferential terms for the different types of technologies and for businesses. And Stuart is there. He's going to talk about it later in terms of our Lombard proposition. Another thing that's specific to SMEs that we launched this year was the green loans and asset financing. So that reduces a lot of the hurdle rates for SMEs to get access to green financing. It also includes things like, instead of a 50,000 requirement on the loan, we've brought it down to 25,000. So more and more SMEs can have that access. The second thing that we do is helping SMEs know where they stand in relation to others in terms of their carbon footprint. So again, earlier this year, in September, we launched the Carbon Planner. So what is the Carbon Planner? It is specifically to help SMEs to measure their carbon footprint, to understand what are the actions that they can take, what are the most critical actions they can take to reduce their emissions. If there's a requirement, and when, depending on their emissions, that helps them plan for it. And through that, they can also access funding from us or think about what the funding options are. What would be the cost of it? But like I said, more and more SMEs are required to do this with regards to submitting both their climate targets and what their transition plan is. So this is the kind of app that you don't have to be a NatWest customer to access it, but it's a very important part of supporting SMEs and understanding their climate journey and what they can do. And that's something that they can then use when they have to disclose to their customers on what their net zero transition plans are. Next is to supporting SMEs to identify the biggest opportunity for their business, and also helping SMEs to navigate the climate action landscape and connecting businesses to resources needed. Now, the key thing that happens in both of that is that we've launched 6 accelerators, and 25% of all those accelerators are dedicated to SMEs who are focusing on climate. So what these accelerators are about helping SMEs in understanding this landscape, understanding where the market access is, figuring out how they can scale up. And so it allows for a lot of the coaching there. We've also required all our relationship managers. We've launched with the University of Edinburgh and Cambridge learning facilities internally for all our employees, and particularly for relationship managers, so they can have a very purpose-led conversation with the SMEs on what they can do, what are the business opportunities, how do they have that. And there's some great studies here in the report that really focuses on that, on how, because of the relationship managers, because they could have a meaningful conversation with their SMEs, they could actually help them in figuring out, one, getting access to the right loans for becoming a lot more sustainable, and then two, understanding where the market access was, and three, understanding also with government regulations and things like that, how they could be much more supportive. So these are the ways in which I'm very proud of working with Natwest. Last year when they approached me, I was a little cynical, but then when I understood that they had, one, engaged with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which required them to do a lot, but then two, really seeing and working within the teams to see what we're willing to do to support our customers in their climate journey, I'm not only very inspired, but I'm also very happy because I spend a lot of time conceptually thinking through things. Being here makes it a lot more concrete. And I'm very happy to see that Reading is going to become a climate hub. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you about that. Thanks.
You're always welcome in Reading with a story like that. Thank you very much, Maria. And I think it's fair to say that SMEs being the engine room is not lost on us after that as well. So thank you very, very much indeed. Before we dip into some lunch, which I think was at 12:30, any questions for Maria, please? And we have Liana this time on the microphones. You're all just really hungry. Please, Peter.
Thanks, Maria. That was great to hear. Given the scale of that opportunity, and you've partly answered this, I think, in your last couple of slides, but what's stopping people? Are we not as entrepreneurial as we think we are? Is it lack of knowledge? Is it people don't think it's real? Your thoughts?
So one is actually a lot of the requirements, a lot of the ways in which customers can reduce their emissions. Right now, the way to do it is an upfront loan. So high upfront capital costs, meaning the way we would provide the financing is through debt, much more favorable terms. But when you are facing a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, I mean, I can definitely say this for our farmers, they need to see the investment case. Now, the wonderful thing about this is we're showing you the payback is there. It's more of a psychological and a willingness to take on an upfront loan when you're worried about just paying the short term. So it's much easier for customers to just pay a bill than think through having to pay, even if it's a large one that you could cut up the payments, the idea that you just pay for the individual ones. But we're seeing more and more customers when we can. I'll give you an example. An agricultural farmer had to renegotiate their energy price. They were coming to the end of a contract, a long-term target on energy prices. And this was the time which was critical for them that they could renegotiate that. And so when the prices went up, suddenly our loan became a lot more attractive to them. So it's unfortunately the idea that it goes back to my point. You need to invest capital in order to achieve those savings. But if you can't, you're not willing to invest the initial capital, just even for the savings bit. So we as a bank are thinking through how to reproposition that in a way that would work for our customers.
It's the short-termism, isn't it? Still, everybody's still at the moment with everything else going on. It's just so short-termism because, it's scary, particularly as something to be looking down as well.
Exactly, but actually something I forgot to say is that this month we are holding 3 events for SMEs, startups, those which are within the 3 million bracket and those which are above the 3 million bracket, in terms of thinking through how they could get access to the right financing to be able to do that. Another thing in terms of the short-termism, if you are an SME that is really struggling with your bills, we've partnered with Step Change, which is a charity that focuses with SMEs on how to actually manage that and to actually address the cost of living crisis, figure out what the facilities you need and the financing you need, and how to support that going forward. Yeah.
Great session. The thing that struck me in the numbers that you mentioned was a couple of things. One is the size of the opportunity is massive, and it's a large proportion of that is with buildings and retrofitting, and one would have thought that isn't rocket science. You know, that, we're not sending people to the moon. It's not Artemis. And yet, when you had the trial that you did, the life journey, you had 9, options, and only 3 were taken up because of lack of skills. What are we doing around that area in terms of, is this a government thing? Is it what can we do as a local community around skills? For example, that there are apprenticeships around putting in heat pumps or insulation or retrofitting buildings and things like that.
So 2 things. One is, yes, I do think there needs to be a lot more government funding into vocational training on really with builders on upskilling. There's also a PAS standard, which is about what would be the skills you would need to be able to do those retrofits. I really recommend the supply chain school. They have great online learning tools, and so you as a local council could actually pay for the subscription to get access to that. So it's a bit similar to what Akil did with his, but this is specifically for builders, specific to learn. And so builders won't pay for it, but you could offer it at as a subscription service. And so buy that and put it as a support. So they learn through it. They could have the incentives, and then that helps with the really at least the skills element of it.